Moving on to chapter 4 then. Chapter 4 is one of the most important chapters in the book. Obviously, we've seen Crooks in chapter 3 briefly. We've heard about him through Candy in chapter 2. But this is the first time we get a real insight into Crooks's room, his belongings, him as a character, and obviously how he interacts with the other characters in this chapter. So the key moments in this chapter then are going to be obviously the heavy description of Crooks's room at the start of the chapter. So chapter 1 we had the description of nature down by the brush, where George and Lennie were. Chapter 2 you had the bunkhouse description, and obviously you've got chapter 4 now, which is the lengthy description of Crooks's room. We see what kind of character Crooks is from the room and the way it's set up, from his belongings and so on. So there's lots to be said about Crooks's room. Then Lennie enters, obviously completely unaware of the segregation between white and black people at this time, and just completely crosses this divide and goes into Crooks's room, resulting in quite an angry reaction from Crooks, which obviously eventually disappears because Crooks is quite pleased to have company for once. Then you've got the conversation between Crooks, Lennie and Candy. Candy enters much more reluctant to enter than Lennie was, but then does get coaxed in eventually. Then you've got the conversation about the dream. So Lennie tells Crooks about the dream, and Candy does. Crooks has got an initial pessimism about the dream. He's very incredibly negative, doesn't think it's going to come true because of the hundreds of men he's seen with exactly the same thing in their head, with land that they're never ever going to get. So Crooks is incredibly realistic in this chapter for us when we think of context. He's the most realistic out of all of them, in the sense that he knows that this can't come true for them. He's seen it plenty of times before. You've then got the kind of climax of this chapter, Curley's wife's entrance, where she comes in obviously looking for company. She's been left behind. All of the men have gone to the brothel to Susie's place on a Saturday night, leaving all the weak ones behind, as Curley's wife says. So you've got Crooks, Candy and Lennie, and obviously she's come in for some attention, for some company. They're not happy with her being there. Crooks, stands up to her even, and she ends up insulting all of them, particularly Crooks, where she threatens him, and she's particularly harsh and incredibly racist. And then this results in the death of Crooks's dream at the end. He tries to get in on their dream farm idea. He gives in to it, allows himself to give in to it just before Curley's wife arrives, offers to work for free on the farm, and then obviously that dream dies at the end when Curley's wife puts him back in his place. So those are the key moments in chapter 4. So obviously we start chapter 4 in the same ways that we start the other chapters when we get introduced to a new setting. So chapter 1 and chapter 2 talked us through the description of the brush at the start of chapter 1, which is nature, where George and Lennie find themselves before they go onto the ranch. Then we got a description of the bunkhouse in chapter 2, and it's no different for chapter 4 when we get introduced to a new setting, which is obviously Crooks's room at this point. So there's a lengthy description at the start, and I'm not sure if we've mentioned this before, but the book is written very much like a play, and at the start of these chapters with the new settings, you've got these lengthy descriptions which could be seen as stage directions, because obviously if this was going to be performed on a stage, the stage direction would help the director be able to know how to set the stage and so on. So at the start of this now, obviously you've got the reference to the bunkhouse, that his bunk in the harness room, where Crooks sleeps, which is a little shed that leaned off the wall of the barn. So the phrase leaned off there would indicate to us that he does not sleep in the same place as the white men do. So he's segregated from the others because of the colour of his skin. So as well as being introduced to him as sort of the Negro stableback or the nigger, and obviously we saw the casual racism that was prevalent there, we also now see the racism in the fact that he's not actually allowed to sleep where the other men are. And this isn't through choice, this is something that is forced upon him. So he tends to the horses and the other animals on the ranch, which is an incredible skill job. So he says they've been alone, Crooks could leave his things about, and being a stableback and a cripple. So a stableback, like I said, is quite a skilled job where he has to look after the animals and so on. Yet he can't obviously sleep where the other men sleep. So even though he's got quite a skilled job, more skilled in some sense than their jobs, he's still not allowed to sleep where they are. So obviously this will tell us about racism during this era, and obviously that's a direct link for context. And we need to please try and remember how important context is. If we don't mention context in our exam, in our essays, then we don't get C grade. So we have to always try and see how things link to context. What do they tell us about America during the 1930s? And in this case, chapter 4 tells us a lot about Crooks and his treatment. So obviously we know his name is due to the fact that he's got a crooked back, so he's a cripple, as it says there in the second quote, and he was more permanent than the other men. So like I said, more permanent potentially because he was so skilled at what he does, but also permanent potentially because he is crippled and hasn't got anywhere else to go. So this could be seen as some kind of generosity from the boss, where he does keep him on despite the fact that he's crippled, but it could have something to do with the fact that he's so good at the work he does as well. His name Crooks as well, obviously direct reference to his disability, the fact that he's crippled, he's got a crooked back. But also, we talked about this in class, the connotations of the word crook, what it might suggest to us and what it might tell us about him. So the fact that a crook is a criminal, so stereotypically black people would be seen as criminals and thieves in that era. So the word crook could be a direct reference to that as well and give us an idea about the way black people were portrayed during that time. So there's lots to think about behind Crooks's name, just as it was to think about behind Candy's, Curley's and so on. But Crooks's name is perhaps a little bit more significant than those. Crooks is obviously alone. It says being alone, he could leave his things about, so he's more permanent, so he's alone. And then obviously he's accumulated much more possessions than the other men have. The men carry their possessions in their bindles on their backs, which is a small sack. They just have the essential items that they need. And obviously Crooks is different because he's more permanent and he's accumulated lots of possessions. So although it is indicated to us in this chapter that Crooks is willing to work for nothing, he says later on that he's willing to work for George and Lennie and Candy for nothing on the farm, just to get out of this situation, because there's a hint of friendship between those characters as this chapter goes on. But at this point in the novel, obviously it's not necessarily suggested to us that he's not actually getting paid, because how else would he have been able to pay for these possessions? He's got lots of pairs of shoes. Now the men would really only have one. There would be a necessity. He's got several pairs. He's got rubber boots, an alarm clock, a shotgun, and so on. And he's got books. So it's a plural. He's got more than one book. So he's obviously had some money at some point and is having some money. But obviously this is what he chooses to spend his money on. So he spends it more wisely and on more sensible things than the other men do. They spend their money on drink and on prostitutes on a Saturday evening, whereas this makes Crooks different. But this isn't out of choice, remember. Crooks hasn't got an option to have that kind of lifestyle. This is the one that's been forced upon him because of obviously the colour of his skin. So the fact that he has got a big alarm clock might tell us that Crooks is conscientious, he likes to be on time, he's organised, okay, and we already know he's quite good at his job, so that could be linked to that. And the fact that he's got books as well. We learn that he's got a tattered dictionary in his room. He's got a book to do with the civil rights. So he's very concerned about his rights, and the fact that he's got a dictionary as well could imply to us that he's intelligent, and definitely that he's literate. He can read, he can write. Now, this was quite uncommon as well. You know, black people might have stereotypically be seen as having not as much of a good education as white people, and Crooks in this respect seems to be a little bit more intelligent than the others because he is a reader and they aren't. So obviously this sets Crooks apart. He's not presented as your typical stereotypical black man perhaps would be during this era because of these things. In fact, he's got glasses as well. Glasses, you know, can sometimes be linked to intelligence, and that tells us more about Crooks again. It goes on then to describe Crooks as a proud, aloof man. So despite having very little, and despite the colour of his skin, he's still incredibly proud. He's quite aloof, meaning he doesn't make, he doesn't make too much effort. He keeps his distance, as it says there, and he demanded that other people kept theirs. So he perhaps keeps out of the way of conflict because of the colour of his skin and avoids the kind of prejudice that he's obviously going to be faced with because of his skin colour. So the themes, like we said, he relates to there would be prejudice, definitely, and isolation because of where, physically isolated as well as mentally because of where he sleeps away from all the others. But also Crooks is going to be our top character for loneliness here, one of our characters for loneliness, anyway, one of the most important ones because of these factors. He's lonely because of where he sleeps, physically lonely, obviously mentally and emotionally, and because of the colour of his skin. He had thin, pain-tightened lips, so he's in obviously physical pain because of his back. And we see at the bottom there he's applying some liniment lotion to his back because he's obviously in a lot of pain. But this pain is mental pain as well because of the prejudice and the racism that he faces day in and day out. He's also described as having a meagre yellow light in the room. Meagre means small. That's the American spelling there, ER. We spell it with a RE instead, okay, as in centre. So he's got a small yellow light in his room, that means. Now, we spoke about light previously and how light could be seen as like a symbol of hope. Was the fact that Crooks has got a small yellow light in his room could be indicate to us that he has got very little hope in his life and not a very bright future ahead. And again, this is all linked to this colour of his skin, okay? So when we think of hierarchy of power here, Crooks is obviously going to be at the bottom when you think about the context. People like Curley and Slim and the boss towards the top. In the sense of intelligence, Crooks would be further up the hierarchy, but what is important on this ranch is more, your physical ability and so on, and your status. That gives you the hierarchy and the power, as opposed to the intelligence that Crooks has here. After the initial description of Crooks's room in chapter 4 and Crooks himself, you've then got the section of the chapter where Lennie enters Crooks's room. Now, Lennie's obviously incredibly childlike in his ways, as we've already learnt, and he's also quite innocent and naive and really doesn't recognise the racism of the times. He wouldn't really see the reason for the segregation of Crooks out in the harness room where he's sleeping. So he attempts to come into the room, as obviously he doesn't understand this, and then Crooks obviously gets quite angered and frustrated and isn't very nice to Lennie and talks a lot about rights. So the first quote we've got there is, "You've got no right to come into my room." So he's sort of asserting himself there, and we already know that he's very concerned with rights. We know he's an intelligent man, and this is something he repeats then in the next quote. "Well, I got a right to have a light," because Lennie said, "I saw a light, so I came in. Well, I've got a right to have one." So he's very proud of and protective of what he's got, essentially because he lacks rights. So he seems to want to exert the rights that he has got. And obviously emphasise these to Lennie by repeating the word twice. And he says, "I ain't wanted in the bunkhouse and you ain't wanted in my room." Now, Lennie's not going to understand why Crooks isn't wanted there, and he answers with, "Why ain't you wanted?" Exactly like a child would respond. He really hasn't got a clue, and like I said, doesn't understand the racism of the time. Now, Crooks is obviously incredibly frustrated with this situation and takes this out on Lennie, who really is the wrong person because he doesn't understand why this anger is kind of directed towards him as a white man in this time. So he goes on to say to Lennie, "I can't play because I'm black. They say I stink." So obviously, we talked about Crooks being treated almost like an animal earlier. They shot Candy's dog because they said he stunk the room out. Exactly the same as Crooks. Crooks is again, sort of on the same level as the animals here. They say he stinks and he can't go in there. He's obviously frustrated and angry and looking for some kind of argument here. And obviously, like I said earlier, with the wrong person. He continues to scowl, and Lennie's disarming smile then defeated him because he obviously, I think, comes to realise that it's a useless feat to be continuing behaving this way with Lennie because, like I said, he doesn't understand. Long as you won't get out, leave me alone, and leave me alone, you might as well sit down. So he softens a little and asks Lennie to sit down. Like I said, it's a fine line between wanting to protect his rights and so on, but inevitably Crooks is lonely and wants some company, and that's what he gets from Lennie. So he allows Lennie to sit down. He still continues with his trying to prove his point there about how he's treated with racism. If I say something, why is just a nigger saying it? Again, Lennie doesn't understand this, but he still goes on about it. Continuing to show his frustration to the reader. It's just the talking, he says, it's just being with another guy. So this is where Crooks is kind of envious and I suppose slightly jealous of George and Lennie's relationship here. Like I said, they are quite unique. They travel together. This is what raises some suspicions from the other men. But in Crooks's case, it's something he's quite envious of because just being with another guy is all he wants. He's incredibly alone. And this is why he's, surrounded by all these possessions, because he hasn't got any other sort of comfort or pleasure in his life, does he? And he would like to just sort of be with another man, like Lennie and George are. Crooks then shifts his mood slightly by suggesting to Lennie that George won't come back. So obviously, Lennie is going to get incredibly anxious by this, and I think Crooks here says his face lighted with pleasure in his torture because he realizes that Lennie is almost believing him, and Lennie is clearly getting to Lennie, and it's this sense of power that Crooks has, very little power in this situation, but over somebody like Lennie who has got the mind of a child. So but the fact that he has this tiny bit of power, he holds on to it for this moment, because it's not something that it's usually the reverse. It's Crooks that gets treated in this kind of way and abused with words and so on, and obviously he's enjoying this role reversal here. So if we think about the way Crooks is treated here, like I said, just being with another guy, he's completely on his own. They say he stinks, and again, his enjoyment out of kind of abusing Lennie here really is, kind of shows the abuse that he's getting. We know that slavery obviously was abolished years earlier, but in 1930s it's obviously still very prevalent. People were going through the Great Depression. It was incredibly frustrating and lonely and depressing time for people. And the Dust Bowl as well, wiping out people's farms and losing them money and jobs and homes and so on. It wasn't a very nice time to be a migrant worker, and like we know, ranch life wasn't a particularly nice place to be. So Crooks, I think, seems to get a lot of the abuse sort of directed at him. We already know he's a bit of a scapegoat for the boss, who gives him hell when he's mad and so on. But I think it's the same as the other characters. Crooks is quite easy target for them because of the colour of his skin, and when they can take up their frustrations on, basically. And then he kind of enjoys this, doing this to Lennie in this part of the chapter. However, Lennie's eyes centred then, and he grew quiet and mad. Now, obviously, Crooks would have heard, he didn't see it, but he would have heard what Lennie did to Curley's hand. So he's an intelligent man. He very quickly is going to back down, and he does, because obviously of Lennie's sheer size and strength. He knows the damage and that Lennie can do and the danger there, so he's not going to continue with that. And then he goes on to say then, to talk about it, his loneliness. Now, if we look at our themes there, we've got friendship, we've got a tiny kind of developing, hint of friendship here between Crooks and Lennie. Crooks has finally got company for the first time in this novel, so that's where that comes in, and we know Candy comes in later on as well, and they start to discuss the dream. But Crooks is, more closely linked to the theme of loneliness here, and these quotes here at the bottom are going to be your key quotes for loneliness when you're revising Crooks. And obviously we've got prejudice and dreams and so on, and all the contextual factors I've just mentioned. But these are your key loneliness quotes. A guy goes nuts if he ain't got nobody. So we already know that Crooks is physically unwell. He's got, obviously, suffers with physical pain in his back, but obviously mentally, this is showing the impact this kind of treatment is having on him, on his mental health. This is the impact of the loneliness that he feels. Essentially, it's making him go mad. He says going nuts. Don't make no difference who the guy is as long as he's with you, and that gives us a little bit of a explanation about George and Lennie's friendship. Really, we often wonder why George puts up with Lennie, why he stays where he is and so on. It isn't just for Lennie, is it? I think Crooks's quote is quite interesting there. It doesn't make a difference who the guy is as long as he's with you. So for George, he just enjoys having some company, and obviously puts up with the fact that Lennie behaves the way he does, because he'd rather that than be alone. So we obviously know George gets something out of that friendship as well as Lennie, doesn't he? Crooks goes on to say a guy gets too lonely and he gets sick. That's a key quote, again, developing that idea of going nuts and making you sick, so affecting you mentally as well as physically. And then when Lennie starts to introduce that they're going to get the farm and live off the fat of the land, Crooks, quite importantly then, another key quote, nobody gets to heaven and nobody gets no land. You got the double negative there with nobody repeated twice. And he links, land is associated with the American dream there, and this idea that everyone can be sort of successful as long as they show determination and hard work and so on. But for the migrant workers, obviously this is the idea of owning their own land and living off the fat of the land, like I said, being their own bosses. But for Crooks here, he also sort of puts heaven and land alongside each other. So nobody ever gets land, he says. It's all in their head, and then nobody goes to heaven. So this is Crooks kind of doubting religion as well as doubting the American dream here. And he's incredibly cynical and pessimistic about it, purely because he's been there so long and seen so many ranch workers with exactly the same dream in their heads and never ever getting them. Now, before this era, before the 1930s, this might have been possible for some people, but during this kind of these years that the book is set, this was really an unattainable dream for these ranch workers due to things like the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression and so on, like I've already mentioned. We're now up to the part of chapter 4 where Candy then goes to enter Crooks's room. Now, Candy's entrance to the room is a lot different to Lennie's because obviously Candy is very, very aware of the racism of the time, and he would be incredibly prejudiced. Now, the first time we even heard about Crooks, if you remember, is in chapter 2 through Candy, who introduces him as a nigger and says the boss gives him hell when he's mad. So Candy is openly racist. He uses casual racism towards Crooks. He would be abusing Crooks behind his back and chatting away with it about him with the others, like quite openly, really. So Candy is obviously a little bit embarrassed. That's the way he treats Crooks and speaks about Crooks. And then obviously he's outside his room now to go in. He'd also be quite embarrassed to be seen going into a black man's room as well, given the racist era that they're living in and the prejudice and so on. So there could be two reasons for that kind of embarrassment. And then Crooks, the description there, it was difficult for Crooks to conceal his pleasure with anger. So Candy has to be kind of coaxed into the room, which is completely unlike Lennie, who doesn't realise the segregation and just went in. But Crooks pretends to be angry again because he's still clinging on to that anger and frustration about the way he's treated. But he is secretly quite pleased to have company in his room, firstly Lennie and now Candy. So, this is an unlikely, occurrence for Crooks, and obviously he's quite pleased by it. Candy tries to lighten the mood a little bit by saying it must be nice to have a room to yourself, all this way. Candy, and for Candy, who lives in the bunkhouse, and we know what the description of the bunkhouse was like in chapter 2. It's very cramped, a lot of men living in one space, tiny windows, very little light and little hope, not a very nice environment. So Crooks having his room, this space all to himself, would quite appeal to Candy, this level of privacy, and obviously this is something that Crooks, is making Crooks, as we said, quite mad, isn't it? He's making him mentally unwell, the loneliness. So Crooks replies with quite a sarcastic response, saying, sure as swell, there's a manure pile under the window. And now, obviously, this is sarcasm here, but it does remind us of the fact that Crooks is kind of put on the same level as the animals. So he's sleeping alongside the animals out in the barn, in the harness room by the barn. And there's manure, sort of next to where he sleeps. So again, this would show, this only happens because of the colour of his skin. So it just reminds us of the racism and so on, and the fact that he's put on the same level as the animals, as we said he was in one of the previous slides. He also reminds us of again, the racism. Guys don't come into a coloured man's room very much, but it's important that he, the reference to the two men that actually do go into the room. You got Slim and the boss. The boss would inevitably go into Crooks's room because he's the one giving him the jobs to do, and the boss owns every area on the ranch, so he's allowed to go wherever he wants essentially, and he can go into Crooks's room to give check what work he's doing and so on. Now Slim is different. Slim, it does deal with the horses a lot, and obviously might be going in there for that, but Slim does go into Crooks's room, and he would probably be the only ranch hand there, otherwise Crooks would have mentioned more than just Slim and the boss. So This might reveal to us that Slim isn't perhaps somebody who's got the same level of prejudice as the other characters towards Crux. Now, we already know from the previous PowerPoint that he's the one that calls Crux Crux, whereas the others just refer to him as nigger and negro and so on. So Slim hasn't got that same level of prejudice and isn't perhaps as racist as the other. So Slim, we know, is a very secure in himself. He's a very confident man, as opposed to somebody like Curley, we said, who's incredibly insecure and behaves the way he does as a result. Slim's a complete opposite, and I think Slim's even more secure in himself, that he can just call Crux Crux, and he can just see him like the other men and go into his room when he wants. So that tells us something about Slim's character there. Okay, and that might be why he gets the respect from Crux, where Crux is the only one that refers to him as Mr. Slim. Okay. Candy and Lennie then start talking about their dream again and owning their own land. Crooks, is a bit cruel here in his response. However, he is incredibly realistic, because this is given the era that they're living in, the American dream was very unlikely to come true, as I've already said. So he says, you talk a hell of a lot, but you won't get no land. You'll be a swamp for a year till they take you out in a box. So he's saying to Candy, you'll be sweeping up on this ranch until you die, until they take you out in a coffin, basically, which is quite a harsh thing to say and does upset Candy, because that is Candy's weakness. Candy is acutely aware of that fact and then is reminded of it by Crux. And then he says, Lennie, you'll quit and be on the road in 2 or 3 weeks. Every guy's got land in his head. So he is perhaps the most realistic there about the dream, because he's been there for a long time, and he knows that this common dream that every ranch hand has doesn't actually come true. So he's incredibly pessimistic and quite cynical, but like I said, realistic. And Crux there really does prepare us for the death of this dream by the end of the novel. The idea of the dream farm continues to get developed then in this chapter, where Candy says, everybody wants a little bit of land, not much, just something that was his. So he's just referring there to the context of the time, the common dream of the migrant worker, as I've already said, and the fact that they all kind of wanted it, and they wanted to do it together as well. So that's what really appeals to Candy here, is the fact that he'll have somebody to do it with. So he'd have George, you'd have Lennie, and then even Crux here, as pessimistic and cynical as we've already seen him be, and realistic, like we said, because it's not likely that it would come true. Even Crux actually starts to soften and give in to the idea of this dream, okay, where he says, I never actually really seen a guy do it. Candy has said to him, George has got the land all picked out. He said he's got the money because he's got his compensation money. And for Crux, he's never actually seen men have a stash of cash. He's seen these men go down to the brothel every Saturday, spend their money on women and drink, and not seen anybody actually have any kind of real savings to be able to do it. So Candy having this money makes it become a little bit more real for obviously George and Lennie, but now Crux as well, who's been the most pessimistic and negative about the dream so far. So he says then, I come and lend a hand, and he offers to work for nothing. Now, that's quite an important point there. He's obviously got lots of possessions on this ranch, so the boss, potentially does pay him money for the job he's doing now, but he offers to come and expects to work for nothing, but work for free, just to have a roof over his head. So, it really does show us the racism of the time there, that he would, come along and be expected not to be paid, and would just appreciate being treated almost as one of them, and have that kind of segregation gone, and he would be able to integrate with white men, for once on their level, but obviously not completely on their level, because he's saying he would expect not to be paid. But it really does show us Crux's, a need for independence and to be integrated, with these, alongside these men, and his real need for companionship here, and the dream really does start to become a slight possibility here. There is a glimmer of hope, but as I said before in the other PowerPoints, in the other chapters, we see parts of this novel where there are glimmers of hope, and then the hope gets completely dashed within the next breath. So, and we're going to see that on the next slide now. So the themes here, you've got the idea of this dream becoming a little bit more realistic, this need for independence the Crooks has, and Candy and George and Lennie away from these, rich landowners like the boss in this text. And then you've got obviously the American dream, migrant workers, and then racism again as Crooks is offering to work for nothing on that farm. Curley's wife is the next character to enter Crooks's room, and as I said earlier, we have these moments of hope, like we've seen in the previous scene, where Crooks, looks like he's going to give in now and try and get in on this dream as well, and their dream is looking like more of a reality. And then you've got Curley's wife who comes in then and dashes all of their hopes. So you've got Curley's wife, as she refers to them, as a nigger in this part of the text. So that's Crooks. The dum-dum then is Lennie, and obviously the lousy old sheep is Candy. And within those quotes there, she uses their kind of, things, their weaknesses against them. So Crooks's weakness is the fact that he's a black man. Lennie's weakness is his mental disability, and then you've got Candy's his age and the fact that he's crippled, so he's lousy, he's useless, and then he's old as well. So she uses all their kind of weaknesses against them. But it's interesting how she says they left all the weak ones here. Well, obviously she's including herself there because she would be classed as one of the weak characters. She's treated with prejudice, as we know, because she's the only woman on the ranch. So she is, including herself there as one of the weak ones. So they're the 4 weak characters that have been left behind on a Saturday evening here. Now, all of the other men have gone down to the brothel, to Susie's place, as it's a Saturday night. And the men include Curley's wife, not Curley's wife. So they include Curley. So she's recently married Curley, and he's already going to the brothel with the other men on a Saturday. So this does show you something about the context during the time as well. The women's role and the way women were treated. They would just have to accept in marriage that their husband was going with a prostitute. So it tells you something there. We're very quick to kind of sometimes judge Curley's wife and dislike her, but we have got to kind of look at those kind of aspects as well, how she's treated as a wife by this husband, like Curley, who isn't a very nice man at all. Curley's wife goes on to mention then how they're all scared of each other. That's what, because none of them want to speak to her. They see her as trouble. They don't want her in there. Because every one of you is scared the rest of you is going to get something on you. Now, she's quite observant there and perceptive in the fact that, she describes ranch life to us. We already know there's a very hostile environment, and they're all suspicious of one another, and we've got this real, tension always there. The fact they don't trust one another, and there's that level, the undercurrent of kind of violence throughout the book. So she's quite observant that she spots that everyone's kind of scared of each other, and that's why nobody really trusts one another, and that's why the ranch life is so hostile and not a very nice environment to be in. They say we don't want no trouble. Is that word again used to describe Curley's wife? Trouble. She'll get people into a mess. She's a rat trap. She's jailbait. So they associate her with trouble. She's going to bring trouble for men. And then we really see then Curley's wife's loneliness in the next quote. I think I don't like to talk to somebody every once in a while. She's the only woman on that ranch. She's young. She's attractive. She hasn't got a nice relationship with her husband, we already know. She has not got a point. She has not got a role on that ranch. She's not your stereotypical housewife, mother, as we as women, in that nurturing role the women needed to be in for men. She puts herself in the other category, and she has got nobody to speak to. So we should feel some level of sympathy for Curley's wife here, and the loneliness that she must feel, reducing herself to come in and speak to these men who she deems the weak ones just for company. She then sort of gives us a hint about her dream then. So the theme of dream comes into this. So if the theme of dreams came up in the exam now in January, Curley's wife is going to be one of your key characters here, along with obviously Candy, Crooks, George and Lennie and so on, but she's going to be one of your key ones, and her American dream is going to be slightly different from theirs. They've got the common ranch worker's dream, which is to own their own land. Curley's wife, as a young woman during this era, wanted to become an actress. So she says, I could have went in the shows, and there's a man who said he was going to put her in the pictures. So she wanted to be a famous actress. So she's, like I said, very young, very naive, and sees these women on the screen. If we think about the film industry in the 1920s, 20s and then into the 30s. You've got these film stars, these actresses, and they were very glamorous and, you know, sort of looked like they had this level of independence that your stereotypical, you know, woman wouldn't have had during that era. And it was something that was, you know, people wanted to aspire to. That's what they wanted to be like. And Curly's wife in particular wants to be like these women that she sees on the screen, which might be a reason why she dresses the way she does on the ranch. But, you know, what she doesn't see is that is going to be unattainable for her. And even behind the screen, these women, these actresses, would have been controlled by men essentially anyway. And Curly's wife is too young and naive to see that, and she deludes herself into thinking that the man she spoke to was going to put in the pictures, when more than likely the man she spoke to was using her. And she doesn't see that, does she? And she went straight off then and married Curley shortly afterwards. Then the man said he'd write to her, he never ever did, and she went off and married Curley, and obviously is now incredibly unhappy. She says everybody's out doing something. It's a Saturday night, and there she is talking to a bunch of bindle stiffs. So again, incredibly offensive and insulting these men. And as I said earlier, the nigger, dum-dum and lousy old sheep. But she says she's liking it because there ain't nobody else. So again, really highlighting her loneliness to us. So again, if loneliness came up in the exam, Curly's wife is going to be one of your key characters you would have to mention in that essay. All of a sudden then a change comes over old Candy. So we know he's quite defenseless. He's old, he's going to be a target, he's vulnerable. But a change comes over him. He doesn't, you know, he sticks up for himself. He says, you ain't wanted here. Now, that is not going to go down well with Curly's wife, because she wants some company, but she's also the boss's daughter-in-law. So she's going to try to assert herself here. And Candy makes himself, like I said, quite vulnerable. Curly's wife has shown her vulnerability here to them, and that's the way he responds. So she's not going to like that response, is she? He was master of the situation for once. And Curly, he says, maybe ain't going to like his wife in the barn with us bindle stiffs. So he repeats her words, you know, to her, and is encouraging her to leave. Now, he says, you just get out and get out quick. I'm going to ask the boss now to let you come in the barn no more. Now, this is from Crooks now, not Candy. So Candy has been the master of the situation, tries to get her to leave. And Crooks now, for the first time, sticks up for himself, you know, steps out of that shell, that protective shell that he puts on. And he really tries to defend himself and, you know, protect his rights. It's his room. And he's going to ask the boss never to come in there, that she's never to come in there again. Now, she verbally attacks him here. Okay, she's verbally abusive, and we, you know, she turns on him and targets him purely because of the colour of his skin here, and she can. If we think about that hierarchy again, you know, Curly's wife is, in one sense, you know, she's a complex character. She's going to be at the bottom of the hierarchy because she's a white woman. She's a woman. But she's going to be, you know, if in comparison to something like Crooks, she's going to be further up because she's married to the boss's son. So she has got that level of power over Crooks. But even Crooks has got a name. He's got a nickname, Crooks, and Curly's wife hasn't. She hasn't even been afforded a name. So, you know, this is what makes her quite complex. In some cases, she's got obviously a level of power over Crooks, but in some senses, she's actually more vulnerable than Crooks, as, you know, she's not even afforded a name, is she? If you can see Crooks's response as soon as she, you know, turns on him, yes, ma'am, you know, incredibly respectful, knows his place, and has been reminded of that by Curly's wife and goes straight back into it. And then she says to him, you keep your place then, nigger. Incredibly offensive there. I could get you strung up on a tree so easy it ain't even funny. That is going to be like a key Curly's wife quote, a key Crooks quote. If you had an essay on either of those characters, you have to be mentioning that quote. That is a direct reference to the lynching of black men that was going on during that time. And that's such an offensive, you know, upsetting, shocking thing for us to hear as a modern day reader, for Curly's wife to come out with. But that is, you know, one of the reasons why Curly's wife is extremely disliked you, as well as we start, you know, feeling sorry for her and we see how lonely she is. A comment like that again makes the reader quite dislike Curly's wife. You know, they haven't learned a lot about her at this stage. She comes into it much more in chapter 5, but this part of the text, she's not a very likable character at all, and really shows her power as a white woman married to, you know, the boss's son, over Crooks, and he knows that straight away. She's reminded Crooks of his place, and any, you know, any thoughts that he had of getting in on that dream farm are gone, and Curly's wife has reminded him of this. Okay, so you got your key themes there: prejudice, loneliness, friendship developing between Candy, Crooks and Lennie until Curly's wife comes into the room. You've got the level of vulnerability that the characters show, and obviously the dreams for Curly's wife and so on. Okay, context is down the side as well. You know, obviously the sexist way that they refer to Curly's wife being trouble and so on, and obviously the racism and the reference to the film industry where Curly's wife wants to become a famous actress. They managed to get Curly's wife then to leave by sort of suggesting, Candy suggests that he can hear the men coming back, and which is right because George then returns. Curly's wife's gone, George comes into the room. Now, George is obviously quite surprised to see Lennie and Candy in Crooks's room. George is going to be as racist as the rest of them. You know, in chapter 2 when Candy says the stablebuck's a nigger, he just replies casually, nigger her, because it was commonplace to use that terminology. So George would be seeing this as quite unusual, and he would be quite suspicious about why they're in Crooks's room. Now, Crooks at this point then has obviously been reduced to a level now to protect himself from what Curly's wife is saying. And it says he seemed to slowly come out of the layers of protection that he had put on. He would be used to having to behave this way and protect himself in this way because of the way he's been treated with racism and prejudice for such a long time. And then he says, I ain't sure I want you in here no more. So we said about Curly's wife reminding him of his position on the ranch as a black man. And then, you know, he maybe was kidding himself for a time that he could be any different. And she's reminded him of the fact that he can't. So he says he doesn't really want them in there anymore. Candy says, you know, quite offensively again, calling Curly's wife a bitch. You know, we need to be thinking about the words that are used to describe her. They're going to be a key quote for Curly's wife. The bitch didn't ought to have said that to you. So Candy, you know, was trying to be nice to Crooks there. You know, even though Candy himself is racist, he still notices that what Curly's wife said was particularly harsh. And he tries to shake it off Crooks. It wasn't nothing. You guys coming in and setting made me forget, but what she says is true. So like I said, reminded of his place and the racist era he was still living in despite slavery being abolished. You know, in 1865, Crooks is still treated the way he is, and you know, more so in that era, people were incredibly frustrated. Like I said, Curly's wife's no different, and Crooks gets kind of the backlash then, doesn't he? He says you oughtn't be in here, so you know, again, protective over his room, his rights. You know, that's George. Sorry, George says you shouldn't be in here, and Crooks says to him, I told them, but they came in anyway. So Crooks obviously liked the fact that they were in there for a time, but Curly's wife has reminded him of his position, and he's ultimately going to end up alone again. So, you know, we've got themes of prejudice again in this one. Dreams, you know, he escaped his bleak and lonely life for a moment where he attempted to get in on the dream, and then Curly's wife reminded him and put him back in his place. You had a developing friendship at the start of this, and then that friendship has gone by the end. Now we don't see Crooks after this chapter, unfortunately, and that would tell us something about, again, the context of the time, okay, the racist era they were living in and so on. I said earlier that Crooks kind of prepares us for the death of the dream, and he does. Obviously, we know that dream is ill-fated from the start anyway, and it's heavy foreshadowing to suggest that dream is not going to come true. George scowled. He says, I thought I told you not to tell anyone about that, because he discovers that Lennie and Candy have told Crooks about the dream now. And Crooks just says, I wouldn't want to go to no place like that, which is obviously a lie. He would want to, but he knows he just can't, okay? And then Candy says, well, okay, if you feel like that, good night. And like I said, it's the death of the dream. It's the last we see of Crooks. And obviously we've got a theme of dreams, loneliness, American dream, and then racism again here. And this is the finishing part of the end part of chapter 4.